room. The reading room. The reading room. The reading room.
This is episode 20, Die Another Day.
The film begins in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. Bond is betrayed, captured, and held hostage for over a year. He then sets off to track down the man he was traded for, North Korean intelligence operative and terrorist Zhao. Bond chases Zhao around the globe to a shady billionaire and a plot to change the world, but Bond soon discovers that no one is who they seem to be. So Jay, that's the summary, but what do you remember before you rewatched it recently?
This is similar to the last few weeks, Andy, when we've been recording these podcasts and watching the Brosnan films. I don't remember much about the actual storyline, but I remember the kind of like the actors or certain features. So, for example, in this one, I remembered Halle Berry was in there, and I remember she was some kind of American spy. I remembered Toby Stephens was the villain. Rosamund Pike was in there. Madonna. I remembered the invisible car. Also remembered the main henchman, Zhao, had a skinhead and he had diamonds on his face, but I couldn't quite remember how he got those. And also the fencing scene I remembered. But other than that, I didn't really remember. So I didn't remember about the North Korea, storyline. I didn't remember that. And it was like certain little bits. I think everyone remembers the invisible car. I don't know really, from this movie. So again, it's a common theme with the Brosnan films. I don't really remember much about the storyline. So it's just certain bits. And like I said, about actors or actresses. What about you?
Yeah, Jay, similar to you, I don't remember much about the actual story. I just remember certain scenes or characters. So for me, I remember Madonna being in the film. Obviously, the invisible car, like you said, I think everyone remembers. I remember Halle Berry, but again, I didn't remember the character that she played. I just remember that she was in it. I remember a fencing scene, which I think involved Madonna as well. And I also remember the part about Bond being held hostage. That was the only real plot point that I remember. But otherwise, yeah, my memory was... I was struggling to think what happened in this film. So, moving on, we're collecting information on villains and Bond girls. Let's start with villains. It's quite the list this week, actually. So, we have Gustav Graves, we have Zhao, Miranda Frost, Colonel Moon, Mr. Kill, General Moon, Dr. Alvarez, and Vlad. And I think that's probably the longest list of villains we've had for a Bond film so far. Just the two Bond girls this time. We have the aforementioned Miranda Frost, and we have Jinx.
And the theme song in Die Another Day was by Madonna. And the opening credits, so we've got scorpions, the usual models, Bond being tortured, and the opening credits was used to bridge the time jump, really, in Die Another Day. You've got hot coals, women in flames, electrical torture, sparks and ice models. So it was really keeping with the theme that we've had in the last few Brosnan films, where it was relatable in the credits and for the actual film. Next one we're monitoring is the body count. So this is James Bond kills only, and a 31 in Die Another Day. So respectable body count here, and obviously we can see how that ranks later on in the podcast.
We have a whole list of gadgets. We have the Omega Seamaster's watch, the invisible car. We have a glass smashing ring, a virtual reality device, a mini scuba breathing device, and Switchblade, which is like a glider that's used to avoid the radar. The time it takes for Bond to say his James Bond introduction is 51 minutes and 56 seconds, so quite a way into the film before we hear that line. We do have martini drinking, but we don't have hat wearing or hat throwing this time round. So Jay, next question. What was your favourite scene from the film?
I struggle with this one, Andy, because there wasn't many really good scenes that kind of stood out. So I'm going to go with the it's one scene, but it flashes between two parts. So you've got the Bond Graves fight, and then Jinx and Frost fight, and that is on the aeroplane. But otherwise, there wasn't really much to write home about in terms of favourite scenes. I really struggled, and I had to come back to this one, Andy, when we're writing up the notes, because sometimes, when we watch the film, something might jump out, and I was thinking like, what jumped out? And I thought I wasn't going to pick the invisible car, so I was really scratching my head on this one. What about you, Andy? Was it easier for you?
No, I had a similar problem really. There were a few good scenes, but no real standout great scene for me. I've gone with two, but the one I'd sway towards is probably the fencing scene, which obviously we'll talk in greater detail later on, but I thought it was a really good action scene, a little bit silly in places, but generally it was fun. But I also quite like the opening scene as well, with the hovercrafts and the landmines. That had some good moments, although not enough to make it a standout scene for me. Next question from EJ that we ask every week is, how many times did you reach for your phone?
0. Again, Andy, I've been very consistent in terms of not reaching for my phone, so another pat on the back, I think, this week. I wasn't even tempted, Andy, if I'm being honest, during Die Another Day, which I was a bit surprised, because I was thinking this was going to break my good run at the moment, so I was quite pleasantly surprised. What about you, Andy?
You are Mr. Discipline himself. I also went for the disciplined approach and did not reach for my phone at all. No Googling who people were, none of that, so I stuck to it. Okay, now the all-important question. In the rating room, we're all about the ratings. So, Jay, what was this out of 10?
5 out of 10. And for me, it was a solid 5 out of 10. And that's not being disrespectful, Andy, because when we started this podcast, I was dreading watching this film. It was probably the only film in the franchise that I thought, oh, I've got to rewatch that one. So I was thinking it was going to be a low number, but I was pleasantly surprised, actually. Like I said, I didn't, check my phone once. Last week I mentioned in The World Is Not Enough, I paused the film 3 times to see how long it was, left on the film. I didn't do that once in Die Another Day. So obviously we're going to talk about the rankings later on where it actually lands. But I was pleasantly surprised, 5 out of 10. It really surprised me, actually. And it wasn't a film that it didn't seem too long. It wasn't one of those I'm thinking, just hurry up and get to the end kind of thing. So even though 5 out of 10 doesn't sound great, I was pleasantly surprised. What about you, Andy, this week? How did you score it?
So thinking back to last week, we disagreed on quite a number of things, didn't we, in terms of our thoughts on The World Is Not Enough. So far, I'm agreeing with everything you've got to say. I also went with 5 out of 10. I found it to be better than I remembered it being, better than I expected it to be. And it's one of those films where I think it was starting... in my mind, I was thinking this is going to rank quite highly, because I think there was enough good in the first half of the film that I thought, actually, this is a really solid outing. But then things went a little bit downhill for me. Some of the silliness overstepped its mark. Some of the gadgets were a bit too far. Some of the scenes were... I don't know, it just felt like the more the film progressed, the more I stopped enjoying it. And I think it started well and then deteriorated. So, we could have been looking at a solid 6 or even 7 had it continued in the right vein, but towards the end, I was getting a bit fed up with it. So I landed on 5 out of 10.
Yeah, whereas I think for me, it was largely kind of a flat line, and then it went down with the invisible car, and then it went down for certain bits, like you said, were a bit silly or too futuristic, but otherwise there were no really strong high points. So it was kind of like just consistent in terms of, just kind of a flat line, which was, not too bad, but there were just certain silly elements, whereas World Is Not Enough, I really struggled. I was thinking today, actually, before we started recording this, I might need to rewatch that film again to see whether... Because like I said last week, I wasn't tired or anything. I wasn't in a bad mood or anything like that. But I just really struggled last week with World Is Not Enough. Whereas this one, It's 5 out of 10, so obviously it's not a great movie, but, you know, I quite enjoyed myself watching it this week.
That's quite an interesting viewpoint, but I'm more interested in the third viewpoint that we get on this podcast series, and that is from your wife. What did she make of the film?
So she struggled this week, Andy. So I didn't time this, but you know the opening credits and the music, you know, where basically Brosnan's getting tortured and you got Madonna singing, you know, the opening theme song. She said that was really too long. And I was thinking, well, the opening credits, we obviously talk about it each week, but we've never actually tracked how long they were. So I couldn't really quantify whether the credits were longer than usual. So she said it felt too long. The whole storyline, she said, was very far-fetched and the most ridiculous Bond so far. Invisible Car was too unbelievable. And the bit that she really thought was silly was the car chase near the end, where it was in Iceland, you know, the kind of like the ice palace, and Bond and Zawa, you know, with the cars, and the ice venue, you know, ice palace is kind of melting, but you still got your car chase happening there. She didn't like that at all. She really struggled. And like I said last week, now she's kind of, as we were watching it, she realises it's not the Brosnan films that she enjoyed, it was the Daniel Craig film. So now she's saying, oh, I can't wait until next week when we watch, you know, the first Daniel Craig film. So yeah, she's not a fan really of this one. But I think the things that she mentioned, I agreed with, but I couldn't, like I said, the opening credits I thought was good. So for me, it didn't seem too long. So I don't know what you felt about that. And like I said, we're not obviously timing the opening credits, are we? We're not measuring that.
I thought they were long, but to be expected. I think off the top of my head, and again I could be wrong, it felt like last week's film, The World Is Not Enough, that had a longer opening credit, or at least more happened in that before the credits rolled. Whereas for this, it didn't feel too bad. But it is an interesting point, and I wonder if we could or should track this in future. I don't know. Maybe not as an every film feature, but it'd be interesting to see if there is any stats out there online. Maybe any of our listeners want to do a bit of research for us on the cheap, so we don't have to pay our crack team of researchers too much because they work hard. Tell us what you think. Was this too long? How long was it? Is there any that are longer? Be good to know.
And Andy, a bit of a spoiler alert as well from my side. I have managed to convince my teenage son to watch the Casino Royale film. So, do you remember in one of the earlier episodes, I said he said he was going to watch one. Do you remember? I think I said I was walking the dog and he said he was going to watch one. And then when it came to actually watching it with the wife, he said no, he was too busy. He was playing on a computer game or something. Whereas now he's been seeing me, doing the research, writing notes and doing various bits. And he says, I think I'm going to watch James Bond with you. And he said that during last week. And I said, don't watch Die Another Day. I didn't want his first Bond film to be Die Another Day. So I said, hold off until we do next week's film, Casino Royale. Because I said it's relaunched. So you don't need to have watched any of the others. And so I might be able to add in a teenage son verdict. But then he might stand me up, so I don't know. So a bit of a heads up, really, to you and listeners there.
I look forward to that, and maybe we'll need to translate some of the words that the young folk use these days as well. Let's get a little bit deeper into the film. So let's start with some of the headline facts. This had a runtime of 2 hours 13 minutes, which I think is one of the longer Bond films we've had so far, but still within that broad range of what we've seen so far. Released in 2002, so it's the first Bond film of the noughties, and the director was Lee Tamahori.
Yeah, so now we're going to talk about some general points before we get into the detail in the film later on and some of our regular features. And as always, our regular listeners, will know that I like to talk about the budget and the money side of things straight off. The budget in Die Another Day was $142 million, and for the sixth film in a row, this makes it the most expensive Bond film so far in the franchise. So as I said last week, it's consistent now. They're just breaking the record every movie in terms of the budget. So that's nice. That's a budget increase of $7 million as well compared to the previous film 3 years ago. And just a little fact here I thought was quite interesting. And I know you've got inflation and everything, so, the 7 million difference, it is not, the same as it was then. But the 7 million difference was the whole budget of Live and Let Die, which was obviously Roger Moore film in 1973. So a little tidbit there that I thought was quite interesting. So what did that buy us in terms of the budget, in terms of the box office stats? And Die Another Day took $431.9 million, which when you adjust it equates to around $691 million in terms of worldwide box office performance, which means at the time this was the best performing Bond film in the franchise at the time, which, considering the rating room official ratings was 5 out of 10 for both me and Andy, was... I don't know. A bit hit and miss for me, really, with that.
Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised at that, to be honest, but I guess it just shows that the appeal of Bond was still very strong, even 40 years after its debut. Quick note on Lee Tamahori. Quite a short resume. He's only directed a few films during his career. So before Bond, he had films such as The Edge with Anthony Hopkins and Alec Baldwin, and Along Came a Spider with Morgan Freeman. And since Bond, he directed XXX State of the Union, starring Ice Cube, and the film Next, starring Nicolas Cage. Or if my wife's listening, Michael Caine. I love you very much, dear.
The Rating Room.
Goofs and continuity errors. There were a few during here. We've picked out a few to start with, so I'll start at the end and the final fight scene. There's a fight between Jinx and Agent Frost. Jinx is slashed across her stomach, drawing blood. Later on, Jinx and 007 are pouring diamonds over one another in a typical James Bond type scene, but her stomach is completely unblemished.
And another one between Jinx and Bond. So when they sneak onto Graves' plane, Jinx can be seen with a nickel-plated pistol, and this is evident throughout the entire film. Yet when Jinx is in the cockpit and Frost comes up behind and tells her to hand over the gun, it's now no longer nickel-plated but a standard gunmetal black.
And another one, after the helicopter escape at the end, a red sports car is sticking nose down in the ground after falling hundreds of feet out of the airplane. Not a single crack on the windshield, complete mint condition. And the yellow sports car has the right door open.
Which, that's a great safety feature, Andy. If it falls hundreds of feet and the windscreen doesn't smash, or the car doesn't kind of compress when it hits the ground as well.
Is that a Q feature or is that a car feature, I wonder?
So, moving on, we've been discussing the gun barrel sequence we haven't done it throughout the whole film, throughout the whole podcast, but we've been talking about it quite a few films now. So the director requested a slight change with this one, actually, and he asked that a bullet be added to the sequence, which is seen zooming from Bond's gun to the audience.
I liked the bullet. I thought it was a nice touch, but the music accompanying the gun barrel sequence again didn't sound right to me. There's been a few times now where it's just sounded a bit off.
Yeah, I know you pointed out, haven't you, in the Pierce Brosnan films, some of them you like, some of them you haven't liked, have you?
I don't know whether it's an attempt to modernise the music and sound effects, but it just feels like one of those things that didn't need to be changed. Falls very much under the category, if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Yeah, and when the bullet happened, Andy, so I don't know if you picked it up when you were watching it. When it happened, I must admit, I thought, what's that? So I made a little note on my pad to say, make sure we research this, because I thought, I'm sure that's never happened before.
I certainly don't remember a bullet zooming towards the screen. But, I liked it. It was a good touch. But anyway, from there, we're in North Korea. The film opens with 3 men surfing. We soon find out that one of these is Bond, and he's with 2 other agents.
Andy, I didn't make a note here, actually, but it just kind of reminded me. What did you think of the CGI with this bit? Because, well, in terms of that scene there, because I personally liked it. You know, when it was happening, you saw one person and then like the wave, and then another person appeared and then like a wave. So you didn't see all three, did you, at first? It was like slowly built up. What did you think of that initial opening compared to the openings we've had so far in the Brosnan films? We've had some real highlights, haven't we?
It was okay. It didn't stand out to me. Your point on the CGI, I didn't make a note specifically for this scene, but CGI is a recurring feature that I made notes on several times, and spoiler alert, not always in a positive light.
Yeah, I agree. It's the CGI. I don't even think it's dated. I think it was quite poor for the time as well, actually, from having, you know, done research and stuff.
Yeah, dated's the wrong word. It was just bad. It's badly done. I think that's the only thing there is to it, because we've seen some really good. I think we've commented on some good CGI in the previous Brosnan films, but this time around, I don't know whether it was a change in approach, a change in software, or just attempts to do things too complicated, but it felt like it took a backward step.
Yeah, I agree, Andy. So, moving on, Bond takes the place of an African diamond dealer, and he proceeds to hide a bomb under the diamonds in a case. This is where we meet Colonel Tan's son Moon for the first time, and you can see him beating up a punch bag that you find out actually has a body in it. Colonel Moon is actually played by Will Yun Lee. Yeah,
there was a nice quote here about him needing a new anger therapist after he let the person out of the bag. But on to Will Yun Lee, just a couple of points about him. Featured in a number of film roles, including Total Recall, The Wolverine and Rampage, and also several TV series as well. Witchblade, Hawaii Five-0, Altered Carbon, and is currently in the series The Good Doctor. Moving on, Bond meets Zhao for the first time. Zhao is a North Korean operative and terrorist, portrayed by Rick Yoon.
Yeah, Rick Yoon has featured in a few films, including Fast and Furious, Ninja Assassin, Olympus Has Fallen, and Alita Battle Angel. And I must admit, Andy, he's someone that I recognised, and I remembered him from the Fast and Furious. But as part of the research, he's not actually been in many films or TV programmes. So I don't know if it's just because I've seen the Fast and Furious quite a few times that I think he's been in a load of different films. Because I haven't seen Olympus Has Fallen. I've not seen Ninja Assassin. And when I looked at his kind of CV, there was nothing else that jumped out. So it must be from Die Another Day and the Fast and Furious. So I don't know if it's someone that you've recognised before.
No, not a clue. And all those they've listed, I've not seen. If we ever do a future series on the Fast and the Furious franchise, you will get to see an angry side of me. I have seen the first film. I hated the first film, and I vowed never to watch any more Fast and Furious films ever again.
He's in the first film.
Awful film it is. So he obviously had a lasting effect on me if he's in the first one.
So, carry on. Well, talking about cars, actually, next point that we've made here is Colonel Moon is a collector of nice sports cars as well. And I'm not into cars, sports cars or any kind of cars, so I didn't pick out or make any notes of the particular makes, Andy. So I don't know if you did. But there were nice colours and they look very fast, so that's the comment here.
Your knowledge of cars is about the same as mine. They're shiny, pretty colours, but no idea what they are.
They look like they can go fast, so we're assuming they cost lots of money and they were nice. Carrying on, Zhao discreetly takes a photo of Bond, and then he shortly receives a message from someone informing Zhao and Colonel Moon that it's actually Bond and not the undercover African diamond dealer that Bond is portraying.
Yeah, the game is up early. Bond is about to be assassinated, but the bomb goes off in the diamond case, which allows Bond to make his escape. And we then get into a hovercraft chase, which ends up with Colonel Moon going over the waterfall and seemingly plummeting to his death. General Moon arrives on the scene. He's not happy with Bond for killing his son. So this leads to a scene where Bond is captured and then he's being tortured. And as he's being tortured, we then transition into the opening credits.
This whole bit about him being captured and tortured, I didn't remember before watching this, but when Madonna's theme song kicked in, it reminded me about the, Bond being captive. Because like I said, I didn't remember it before, but as soon as the music came on, and I think from memory that the first clip is his head being pushed into like icy water, I think from memory. And then that's where it kind of like just came back saying, oh yeah, that's where he's being, he's been captive for so long. And, that part of the storyline did kind of come back to me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. His head's being forced underwater, and then it kind of goes into the graphics of the opening credits. I thought it was quite nicely done.
Yeah, I think it was very good. So David Arnold returns to the franchise, and this is his third Bond movie so far. As we mentioned, as we just mentioned, Madonna wrote and performed the title song, and Madonna also has a small cameo later on in the movie that we're going to touch on. Strangely, and Andy, I use strangely there because, as I said before, the wife keeps moaning that we keep using interestingly, so I use strangely this time. This title song was nominated for a Golden Globe Award for Best Original Song, but also a Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Original Song. The song did miss out on the Golden Globe Award to one of Andy's favourite bands, U2, for the song for Gangs of New York, but also another nominee for the Golden Globe Award that year was Eminem's 8 Mile. So the song, and in terms of the Golden Raspberry Award, the song also didn't win, I'm using air quotes, the Golden Raspberry Award as well, which went to Britney Spears' film Crossroads. So I don't know, Andy, if you want to mention anything there about U2 or Eminem's 8 Mile, because that seemed to be quite a strong year for original songs in movies.
To be honest, I don't remember the U2 song for Gangs of New York, and Gangs of New York is a fantastic film, but clearly the song was not part of the reason I like it. Eminem's 8 Mile, again, another really, really good film and a really, really strong soundtrack, so no surprise that he would be nominated. I'm surprised that this song would be up for Best Original Song and Worst Original Song. One of those awards is definitely not going to be won by Madonna, I would say. And I will leave that there as a cliffhanger for later on in the pod when we talk theme songs. But what was unusual about the theme song and the opening credit sequence is it was presented in such a way that it actually moved along the film's plot. It wasn't just standalone graphics and pictures and pretty ladies and the usual kind of things we've come to expect from an opening credit sequence. There were parts of it that actually moved the film along, which was quite nicely done, I thought.
I think we're talking about rankings later in terms of theme songs, but I think, this for me was one of the stronger ones because of that reason, Andy. I liked how they tied in what was actually happening in terms of the, Brosnan, James Bond being captive, and it was actually, still continuing to move the story forward. So I really liked that kind of aspect of it.
Yeah, I agree. A nice new wrinkle to the opening credit sequence. As for the title song itself, peaked at number 3 in the UK charts and number 8 in the US charts. And, of course, Madonna herself, the best-selling female recording artist of all time, with over 300 million record sales worldwide. So she knows her way around a hit song.
Do you like Madonna? Like her music?
I'd say she's had plenty of songs that I do like, but she's not necessarily an artist I would go out of my way to listen to. I don't own or have listened to any full Madonna albums, but if she had a greatest hits collection, there's going to be plenty of bangers on there, I would imagine.
Yeah, I agree. Although, when I was a teenager, I did own one of her albums, Andy, on CD. I can't remember what it's called, but it was the one that had something like, I'm not going to try to sing it, but it was something like, I'm Frozen. I can't remember the song. It was called Frozen. Not to be confused.
I remember the song Frozen, yeah. Late 90s would that have been?
Yeah, cause I was a teenager, so I do remember. But I agree. I couldn't name many Madonna songs, and like you, I wouldn't actively put on her album. But when you're out, say, drinking or socializing and the music comes on, it's something, might nod my head to, kind of thing.
80s Madonna is where it's at. That's peak Madonna, in my opinion. I'll give you your information that you're looking for. The song Frozen featured on the album Ray of Light, which was released in 1998. So you'd have been 27 at that time? I jest, of course. Moving on from Madonna, we're then in North Korea and Hong Kong. And we've got another time jump, which is the second of the Brosnan era. There was a 9-year jump in GoldenEye, if you remember from a few weeks ago. This time we see Bond 14 months later. He's been tortured repeatedly, as the opening credits showed, and General Moon tells Bond that he's been abandoned by his people.
Yeah, I did quite like the opening credits here, Andy, because what we see is Bond is taken to the Bridge of No Return, and the place is kind of shrouded in fog, and it looks like Bond is finally going to be executed. You've got like the firing squad there, and General Moon isn't letting on what's happening, and he's still tried to probe, isn't he, about who he got the information from, or he was trying to find out, wasn't he, who his son was basically working with in the West. So we're still probing. And however, though, the firing squad has stood down, and Bond is told to walk across the bridge, and Bond and Zhao meet each other on the bridge, and this is the audience find out this is actually a prisoner exchange, and Bond obviously clocks that's happening as well. Bond gets to the other side of the bridge, and we see Charles Robinson again, so this is the first time we've seen him in Die Another Day. But Bond is quickly sedated, and you see him being checked over by some futuristic robotic medical equipment, including these kind of like laser scanners. And for me, this was definitely the first of several really unrealistic and kind of / futuristic elements in the film that just really seemed out of place, because Bond isn't set in the future, and apart from the gadgets that he gets on cue, it always felt like the franchise was taking place in the present day. However, during the Brosnan era, it really felt like things were starting to get silly, and you kind of commented on that as well, didn't you? And the silly bit, and I know we've got the invisible car that we'll touch on later on, but even straight away within the first 5-10 minutes with all this futuristic medical equipment, this felt really out of place.
Yeah, it did. And if that technology was available 20 years ago, as we are recording this, surely it would be commonplace now, and it really isn't. So I wonder what the motivation was for those kind of gadgets, whether it's almost becoming gadgets for the sake of gadgets, and it's not. Yes, it's going further away from the realms of possibility and reality. Certainly that's what it feels like anyway. But during the checkup, there is a doctor, I assume it's a doctor, around, and he says, liver's not too good. It's definitely him then, which I thought was a nice line. M then comes to visit Bond in the medical bay. She tells Bond that his status as a 00 has been suspended, because they think Bond must have broke during the last 14 months, and he's leaked information to the North Koreans. M tells Bond that he'd still be in North Korea if it was for her, and he's got no use for her or MI6, which is quite harsh, I would say. It's almost like the relationship is becoming more and more fractured between the two of them.
I agree, because when we were talking about M and Bond in GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies, where we discussed that relationship, whereas in The World Is Not Enough, Bond has helped her escape, hasn't he, from being held, she was held prisoner. So you thought maybe their relationship was slightly changing, and then like within 5-10 minutes of this film, she says like what you said, it was still up to her, he's still being North Korea, and now he doesn't have no use for her. So it just feels like we've gone back to like the relationship that we had in GoldenEye now.
Yeah, they're all business all of a sudden, which, it's how it started out and possibly how it should be, but it does feel like a slight change in direction, that's for sure. But following this, Bond fakes a cardiac arrest so that he can escape. He swims ashore, finds out that he's in Hong Kong, And then he walks into this fancy hotel and checks in. The receptionist is obviously quite dubious because of Bond's appearance. He's got long hair and he's got a straggly beard, and he's wearing, it's not a hospital gown, is it? I think it's pajamas that he's wearing, but he's clearly not your typical fancy hotel guest by his appearance alone. However, the hotel manager, Mr. Chang, is available. He recognises Bond straight away and tells the staff to book Bond into the presidential suite.
Yeah, which is great, isn't it? And Bond asks for his tailor some food and a 61 Bollinger. I can't remember exactly which food it was, but it was something fancy. We then see Bond getting cleaned up before there is a knock at the door, and in comes a masseuse. And, you know, I'm thinking, oh, Bond girl number 1 coming in, just what he needs after being held captive. But Bond disarms her and throws something at the mirror. I can't remember what he throws. And it turns out it's a two-way mirror, and Mr. Chang is actually a Chinese operative. And Bond knew all along that Chang was a Chinese operative.
I think what he throws at the mirror is the gun she's got hidden in a stocking. She's got like a little pistol up her thigh, I would say, is about where it was.
Yes, I don't know what. Yeah, I call it a stocking. I don't know if it's the technical term is a stocking. I can't remember what they're.
Yeah, I'm not sure. If there are any lingerie aficionados out there, feel free to send us the names of the lingerie that she was wearing. Maybe it's a garter. Is it a garter?
I don't know. But yeah, let us know. Then we can tell our wives what we want them to buy for Christmas. So yes. Anyway, so moving on. It's interesting, actually, this point. So in the early drafts of the script, Wei Lin, who was obviously in Tomorrow Never Dies, was going to be Bond's ally in Hong Kong. However, they couldn't actually arrange for Michelle Yeoh and Michelle Yeoh to actually be in Die Another Day. So the character Mr. Chang was created. So I thought that would have been a nice tidbit and a throwback. But then, on the other hand, if you had Wei Lin in this part, Andy, I think she'd probably want to go with Bond to actually find out more about what was happening. Whereas having the new character, Mr. Chang, you don't have that past relationship. Because Wei Lin was like kick-ass and full-on and could look after herself and was basically Bond's equivalent in China. I think if she was in it, you were kind of expecting her then to come along in the mission. And Jinx is quite similar to her as well.
Yeah, she's not just going to be a contact, is she? She's not going to be someone you just pop in for a visit and get some information from. She'd be full on in the mission. So would have made for an interesting dynamic, but like you said, would that have meant the role of Jinx was no longer necessary?
Yeah. And the last point before I pass over to Andy, Mr. Chang informs Bond that Zhao is in Cuba, Havana, and he arranges for Bond to travel to Cuba. So I think this is, I know this isn't the first time that Brosnan is going to Cuba, is it?
Indeed it is not, and I suppose we ought to head there now to see what happens next. So off he goes to Cuba, and he meets up with a guy and says he's from Universal Exports. There's that company name again. This gets Bond a meeting with Raoul, who at first seems hesitant to help Bond. Raoul himself is a sleeper agent and ends up working with Bond to help find Zhao. Raoul lends Bond a car and tells him there's a special strange clinic on an island nearby. Interesting note on this scene, Bond introduces himself as Mr. Bond, not as Bond James Bond. So they are clearly saving that for later on. I made a note of this. I don't know if you picked this up. Did you notice the book that Bond looked at when he was in Raoul's office? He was kind of wandering around, picked up a book off the shelf. Did you notice what that was, Jay?
I didn't as part of the watching it, but as part of the research, I came across this tidbit, and then I saw your comment, and I thought that's well done because I didn't spot the real book.
Yeah, I noticed it straight away, and I thought that's familiar. The book itself is Birds of the West Indies. Or it might not be the exact title, but it's a book about birds of the West Indies. Now, what's interesting about this book is that it's written by James Bond, and that is the not the influence. what's the word I'm looking for? It's the
Inspired.
reason, yeah, the inspiration for the name James Bond from Ian Fleming, because Ian Fleming read or picked up this book and decided he liked the name of the author and he would use it for his story. So that's where the name James Bond comes from, which is, I'm going to use that word again, is a very interesting factoid.
It is an interesting factoid, Andy, and that was well spotted there, because I totally missed it. So we see Bond travels to a beach bar, and he's scoping out the island that Raoul obviously mentioned in the scene before. But then Bond notices a good-looking woman exit the sea. So he's got his binoculars out actually here as well. And we found out this is Jinx, and later on we find out she's actually working for the NSA. The scene where Jinx emerges from the ocean in a bikini was a throwback to Honey Rider, and it was actually a lady called Lindy Hummin that she's a costume designer on Die Another Day, and she insisted that Berry wore a bikini and a knife as a kind of a throwback to Honey Rider, which I thought was good. And actually, Andy, this is something that you picked up in a previous podcast. I remember when I said something about, I can't remember if it was Dr. No, but we discussed about a Bond girl being in a bikini. So I can't remember if it was Dr. No episode, because that was obviously, 20 episodes ago. But I remember you saying about Jinx actually having it like I think it was a throwback. Oh, you actually remembered that?
Yeah, I don't know whether it was done for this reason, but of course this was released in 2002, so it would have been the 40th anniversary of Dr. No. Jumping ahead a little bit, I think there are callbacks, reminders of other films in the franchise, so this is clearly the one linked to Dr. No. But a very memorable scene nonetheless.
I have an interesting factoid, I'm going to use your word here, that we haven't documented, and it just reminded me actually when you said about 40 years. Apparently this film was it was deliberately delayed to make sure it was timed for the 40th anniversary.
That is fascinating, because of course, thinking out loud, the last three Brosnan films were released in 95, 97, 99, 2-year gaps, and then all of a sudden a 3-year gap for this one. I didn't realise that was on purpose, but well played. I'm going to make a note that I think I've just said a minute ago, but you'll understand the reason why. Bond introduces himself, but he doesn't use Bond James Bond. He just introduces himself as James Bond. So we're getting more teasing by the directors and screenwriters, the delay in the inevitable introduction. So that's twice now he's tickled us a little bit, but he's not given us the full thing. There's probably better words to phrase that, but I've gone with it now. Jinx, of course, played by American actress Halle Berry, famous for a range of roles including the X-Men film series, Swordfish, Catwoman, and she won an Academy Award for her role in Monsters Ball.
Halle Berry, Andy, is one of those actresses or actors where we obviously both know her. She's really famous, and I think the average person that you talk to on the street would know her. But apart from X-Men, the films that you mentioned there, I have seen them all. But I would struggle to list many other films really that she's appeared in. So I don't know if you can think of other roles that she's appeared in. But I struggled with it when when we were doing this research, thinking obviously she's really famous, but apart from X-Men and Swordfish with John Travolta and obviously Catwoman, Batman. And I have seen Monsters Ball, but I've only ever seen it once. I couldn't really list many other films that she's actually been in.
I'd have to rack my brain to think of many others. The only one that comes to mind is the film Gothica. And I've seen the film Gothica, but I don't remember much about it. The only thing I really remember is the Limp Bizkit song where they covered Behind Blue Eyes. That's my only memory really of that film. And she's in the music video with Fred Durst, I believe.
That's interesting, Andy, because that is a film me and the missus watched at cinema, and that's one of my favourite songs. That's on my random playlist on Spotify. So I have a random playlist where basically kind of songs throughout my life that I like that I kind of don't fit into my other playlist. I just dump on there, and Behind Blue Eyes is on there. So yeah, and that's Gothica is one film I could name, and it was something that me and the missus did watch at the cinema, and we didn't rate it at all. So it's one of those films where you pay, in those days, probably about £10 or something, and then you go out forking out nearly 30 quid with popcorn and everything because you lost like nearly 2 hours of your life there watching a rubbish film. But yeah, I couldn't think of many other films. But we'll go off topic there, so I just thought I'd just quiz you, throw you a bit of a random question there, Andy, because it wasn't scripted. But like I said, she's a really famous actress, but apart from those films, I can't really remember much else. People listening might be shouting like, Jay and Andy, what about this or this film? You know, really obvious ones, but I just can't really think of much.
We're going to get so many angry tweets from Halle Berry fans, aren't we? Feel free to send your angry tweets to our usual social channels. We appreciate all feedback.
Indeed. Carrying on, so Jinx is also the first black Bond girl, hero or villain, in more than 17 years. That surprised me, actually, when typing up and reading through these notes and doing the research. And that is since Mayday, obviously played by Grace Jones in A View to a Kill. And she's the first primary black Bond girl ever to play the heroine. Because obviously in, Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, Live and Let Die, the actress that Rosie Carver is not a hero, not a primary good girl. You know, she's a villain. So 17 years seems a long time.
It does. I was very surprised by that stat. So yeah, what's going on there? That is odd.
I would just check in. Yes, it was Rosie Carver in Live and Let Die, played by Gloria Hendry. So
You
yeah,
never doubted you.
Well, my mind, you know, you pull out some. Your memory's loads better than me, Andy. Now I've hit 40, it's all going downhill. Anyway, carrying on. A wife comment here, actually. So Jinx accepts a drink from Bond, and my wife made a comment to say, well, okay, so basically this female character has accepted a random drink from a stranger. How does she not know? How does she know that it's not spiked or anything? Which I think was a valid comment, but obviously we find out Jinx works for NSA, so in my mind Jinx knows who Bond is anyway, and she's probably thinking he's not going to put any kind of Hypno or anything in my drink, was my fault. So I made a note of the wife's comment, but then I kind of not discarded it because I brought it here for the listeners, but in my mind Jinx knows who Bond is, so I
think that's valid.
Yeah.
Random question, because I don't think it's ever confirmed either way. Do you think Bond knows who Jinx is? Or does he just see a random hot girl emerging from the sea?
I don't think he knows, but which would then question which would make me question his knowledge of counterparts in other agencies. Because I think, later on where he sees her file being burnt in the waste paper bin, he looked a bit surprised then. So that's why I don't think he knew she was NSA.
Maybe she's not had her obituary all over the front page of the newspaper like he has.
Indeed, yes. And the last point before I pass over to Andy, the drinks worked. So pretty much straight away we see Bond and Jinx getting it on, and we've got a sex scene. So that didn't take long. Oh, there was no real wooing in this particular movie for Bond and Jinx. Yeah,
straight to the sex, and again quite an extended sex scene for a Bond film, and somewhat graphic. Nothing was on show, nothing pornographic or anything of that nature. But when you think back to the previous 19 Bond films, it's only really Brosnan who gets any significant on-air time in the bedroom. Everything else is somewhat implied, whereas this was pretty explicit by Bond standards anyway. I do have a question though about certain elements of this sex scene, namely, where did Jinx hide that knife and fruit? And for those of you who have not seen the film when you're listening to the podcast, I mean, it's a bit strange podcast to listen to about a film you've not seen, but if you have seen it, which I'm assuming most of you have, I hope you know the scene I mean. Like, where did the fruit and the knife come from? Very out of place.
It was, Andy, and when I saw your note here, it made me chuckle because that was when I was watching it, that crossed my mind straight away to think. But it was not so much about the fruit, it was like health and safety of the knife being in bed while they're then going to go for round 2. But yeah, that did make me chuckle when I saw your comment there, because yeah, she just pulls it out of nowhere.
Please send your tweets as to where you think she was hiding the knife and the fruit, and we'll move on quickly without saying another word. Bond wakes up alone. Jinx is gone already, but he spots her boarding a boat to the island where the clinic is located. There's a rude bloke knocking around, and Bond decides to knock him out and uses his clinic letter as a way to get onto the island. So I think he punches him, puts him in a wheelchair, doesn't he? And then almost acts as like his carer, I guess.
Yeah, and we've not made a note of this, Andy, and I don't know if you recall. You know the bit where Bond meets Jinx at the bar, but there's that scene where the rude bloke is really loud. Does he mention why he's going to the clinic? I can't recall if he actually explicitly mentions why.
I don't recall that. I saw it as more of the general background of here's a group of men being obnoxious and he was one of them. And I think they were being quite sexist towards, was it to the waitresses or just random guests?
Yeah.
Just generally
and stuff, yeah.
Being a bunch of arseholes, weren't they? And one of them clearly going to the clinic. But anyway, Bond finds a hidden doorway whilst he's in the island, and then there's a mirrored room that he goes through. And this reminded me of The Man with the Golden Gun, Scaramanga's lair or base, I guess you'd call it.
Yeah, Andy, that was a good throwback. Thankfully, there was no knick-knack around this time, though. So, we see Jinx having a consultation with Dr. Alvarez, who is describing the gene therapy where patients can basically have their appearance altered through DNA restructuring. And I think, well, he does mention about basically the homeless people, don't they, and people less fortunate to help with this pricey procedure. And Jinx kills the unscrupulous doctor as well during this bit, and she doesn't mess around. She pulls out the gun and just shoots him. Meanwhile, Bond he's obviously made his way into the special clinic, as Andy mentioned, and he's looking around and he's found Zhao, and he seems to be going through some transformation process. You get like a monitor above I think it was above his bed or to the side of Zhao's face, and then a white guy's face, which you're assuming is basically transforming into his from his regular face to this white bloke. But obviously Bond interrupts this, and they have a fight that moves throughout the clinic, which was a good little fight scene. However, Zhao manages to escape, and then the bomb that Jinx planted goes off as well, and this is where the bit I mentioned where Bond notices the files on Jinx being destroyed in a wastebasket. So I think that bit was quite good.
Yeah, the action's heating up here. Zhao trying to escape, and he's being shot at by Jinx and being chased by Bond, but he somehow manages to escape on a helicopter. Meanwhile, Jinx is being cornered by a couple of guards, and she's on the edge of not a balcony, but it's like the roof of the clinic almost, isn't it? It's clearly in some sort of old building. However, she does a backwards dive off the building, lands in the sea below, where there just happens to be a boat waiting for her, so a nice way to escape. I made a note here, some very, very dodgy green screen or CGI going on. We mentioned it earlier on, and I don't think this was the first or last time this happens, but I thought this was a really quite poor example of special effects.
I agree, Andy. It was noticeable here. Did she wink or wave or something, or just smile at Bond, I think, didn't she, before she kind of dived backwards?
There was some sort of smile or wink or nod, some gesture to say, I'm out of here and I know what I'm doing, sort of thing. It wasn't just an attempt at suicide, that's for sure. Finally, Bond and Raoul examine the diamonds that they got from Zhao's necklace, and Bond discovers they have the Graves symbol engraved onto them.
And now we're back we're in MI6 London now, and M is talking to NSA Chief Damon Falco, who is portrayed by Michael Madsen. And Madsen has been in lots of films, including being a regular in the Tarantino movies. He's actually been in 5 Tarantino movies so far. I thought this was a random casting, Andy. And again, I didn't put this in the script, but considering this is the last Brosnan film, I wondered whether they had the intention of including him in future Brosnan films. Because he's quite a big star, isn't he? And he's only just in this one Bond film.
A big star, and the kind of role that has the potential to be in multiple films, like a Felix Leiter, for example. So yeah, I wonder whether this was the intention of being the start of something bigger.
Yeah, and this next bit I felt was really out of place. I don't know what you thought, Andy. So we hear London Calling, which is a song I was familiar with, but I must admit, as part of the research, I had to Google who actually sang that, and it's by The Clash. So I thought this was really weird, and it's one of the few times in the franchise, and I can't remember which other film it was, Andy, but do you remember the California song that was played in another film, where they've got a non-Bond song being played, like a famous song being played, but this one just felt out of place?
Yeah, I completely agree, and it brought back to mind, was it California Girls? I wish they all could be California Girls. When
yes,
Bond is he snowboarding or skiing?
Yes.
At the time.
Yeah. So it must be a Roger Moore then.
Yeah, must be. But yeah, that was completely out of place. This seemed unnecessary. I mean, clearly Bond's on a plane and he's going to London. Like, did we need the song to kind of aid that? I'm not sure that we did.
No, I don't think so.
Another little throwback though, so Bond's reading a magazine on the airplane, which has an article about Graves, and the words "Diamonds Are Forever" are listed as part of the headline. So that's another throwback to a previous film. And one thing I found out after the fact was that the airline stewardess who came to give Bond his drink was actually played by Roger Moore's daughter.
Yes, indeed, that was a good find, Andy. The Diamonds Are Forever was another thing that I missed, Andy. So that was, when I saw your notes, I thought that was a nice little throwback. And I think later on you mentioned actually how many throwbacks there are, which I must admit I probably missed most of those, except for the 2 that I think we explicitly mentioned later on. So we're introduced to Miranda Frost and Gustav Graves as well for the first time. And this is the bit where he's parachuting near Buckingham Palace. And Graves is played by Toby Stephens. And Stephens has featured in a number of roles, including TV shows like Black Sails and Lost in Space. Stephens actually played Bond in 8 BBC radio dramas, which I thought was interesting. And Toby Stephens is an actor that I've actually seen in various programs. So I've seen a couple seasons of Black Sails. I've seen Lost in Space on Netflix, which is very good.
Have you ever heard a Bond radio drama?
I haven't, but I looked at the 8 that he did, and a lot of them are the... he's done like multiple ones. Like, he's done 8, but I mean he's been in dramas that were different actors. So he's been in some that was like, say, Connery and Roger Moore ones. So I haven't listened to any of the radio dramas, but you can see why he would play Bond in them. I'm intrigued to listen to one. Have you?
I've not now, but obviously we've watched the films. I've read a few of the books, not many. Never listened to any of the radio dramas though, and I kind of think to kind of complete our Bond education, we might need to invest a bit of time reading and listening to such things. Miranda Frost is portrayed by Rosamund Pike. This was actually Pike's film debut, and she won the Empire Award for Best Newcomer. She's been in a number of other movies since, including Gone Girl, which earned her another Empire Award for Best Actress. And as of this recording, she's currently on the Amazon TV show The Wheel of Time. Graves is very slick, very charming. Media seem to love him. and he makes quite the grand entrance, it has to be said. Later on, we see Graves and Frost. They're fencing at a gentleman's club of sorts. This is where we get to see Madonna make her cameo, and she, quote unquote, won the Worst Supporting Actress award at the Golden Raspberries for this role.
Which, Andy, I think, considering she's probably on the screen less than 5 minutes, I think it's really harsh. I don't think it's a great way that she's played Verity, I think her name is, isn't it? But I think that's really harsh. You know, when I was doing the research, and we kind of alluded on this, didn't we, actually, last week's episode? And I thought I remembered Madonna being in it more than this particular scene. But for winning, you know, air quotes, winning the Worst Supporting Actress, I just think it's really, really harsh. Considering she's on screen for like less than 5 minutes and has a few lines of dialogue with Brosnan. I don't know what your thoughts were with it.
I seem to think that she would have been in more than just this scene. I was half expecting to see her on the list of Bond girls, to be honest, before I started watching the film, that she'd be one of the ones on there, but clearly not. And I agree. You know, it's a cameo role. She's in for a few minutes. She doesn't do anything egregious or anything bad. There's nothing hammy or cheesy. It's fine. I think it's fine for what it is. I wonder if there's just something more sinister at play, and there's, you know, they're taking a bit of personal liberty with her there. I agree. I think it's harsh. And what is it harsh though that she's actually won 5 Golden Raspberry Awards for Worst Actress over the years? So maybe it's a legacy thing that she has. But as a standalone, I agree, harsh.
Yeah, she's obviously got form in terms of Golden Raspberry Awards. So Bond is actually introduced as well by Verity to Graves, and this is where he does the Bond, James Bond. You know, Andy's mentioned he's teased us so far throughout this film, and we could finally get the iconic introduction. And Bond and Graves have this fencing duel, and things quickly escalate. So I think Verity basically says to Bond, no one dare fight him because basically he's won loads of money from the other members of the Gentlemen's Club. Bond is, you know, not put off, and they have the fencing. And from memory as well, I think Graves goes 2-0 up, and then I think it's best of 3, wasn't it, Andy, originally?
I think it was, yeah. Do they do like so many pounds per point or something, and
yeah,
then they up the ante after he's won 2 points straight?
Yeah, they do. And then and then I think it's like basically draw blood. But it just, things escalated so quickly, and this is the bit where the wife is saying it's just really far-fetched. And I know you said at the beginning, and you like this, but they're using different types of swords. They're smashing up the place. They're moving around the venue as well. They even go outside at one point, and I think it actually finishes on the outside from memory. And they're causing lots and lots of damage. And I know he's can't remember if he's a millionaire or a billionaire, but he's obviously very well off, so he can pay off any of the damages. But anyway, so Bond finally wins. He manages to slash his torso. I think it's around the stomach from memory. But then we get this typical kind of bad guy behaviour where Graves invites Bond to Iceland. So, he's lost the bet, but he invites Bond to Iceland anyway. So all was forgiven, it seems. And then we're treated to this bit where Bond tries it on and smooth talks Frost, but he gets knocked back. And shortly afterwards, Bond meets M in the underground, abandoned underground, because he gets I think it's an envelope, isn't it, by someone that's working in a gentleman's club, and it turns out to be a key, and then that's when he goes to meet M.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think one thing we've not noted, there is another cameo here in this scene, and I'm trying to think of the guy's name. Is it Oliver Skeet? who was a show jumper, if memory serves me correctly, who briefly appears. I think he either hands Bond the envelope or he hands him something to sign. He's in for just a few seconds, but I recognised him straight away.
I was the same. I recognised him, but I didn't know what he was from at all. So that's why I've not commented or made a note here. But yeah, I did recognise him. It is a cameo. But yeah, I couldn't tell you what he's from. Are you saying he's an Olympic, like show jumper or something?
I think he's a show jumper. I don't necessarily recognise him from show jumping because that's not really my bag. But he's probably done some form of like celebrity quiz show or reality show, and I recognise him from there. But anyway, let's get back on track. So, as stated, Bond's in the abandoned underground. Then we move to MI6. He's cleaning his gun, and he hears some gunshots. So he goes to investigate, and Moneypenny has been killed. MI6 has been infiltrated. M is being held hostage. This has taken a turn. However, it's revealed that this is actually just a training mission. He's got some virtual reality glasses on, and this is all part of a virtual reality scene, not reality itself. So we can relax and breathe easy again. Bond and the new Q, John Cleese, who appeared in The World Is Not Enough as R, they're walking through the gadget rooms, and we get some more throwbacks to earlier Bond films. We see the jetpack from Thunderball. We see Rosa Kleb's dagger shoe from Russia with Love, from the film From Russia with Love. And apparently there are throwbacks to all previous 19 films throughout this film. And we've noted a few already that were spotted, but I dare say we've missed quite a few others.
And yeah, and I've got to hold my hand up here because, Andy, when I saw your note, apart from the two that is explicitly really obvious to me, which was, the jetpack and the dagger shoes from the two films that you just mentioned, I didn't notice any other ones, and obviously you picked up on a couple beforehand. So I think, we could either let our listeners kind of pick out all 19 in the film, or we've got a bit of homework to do, because I'd love to see the 19, unless one of them is the throwback in terms of Jinx, if we're counting that as Honey Rider as a throwback as well, in terms of, Dr. No. But I'd love to see, a list of all 19 films so far with the throwback.
I'm counting it. So I think so far we've seen a Dr. No throwback with Jinx. We've seen The Mirrored Room, which is from The Man with the Golden Gun. And now we've seen Thunderball, the jetpack, the dagger shoe from Russia with Love. So that's 4. I can't remember if there's Diamonds Are Forever on the plane, so there's 5. So we're 5 out of 19. I'm not sure if there are any others as we go along. If there were and I made note, we'll obviously talk about it. But one thing I did remember from this scene as well is when Q hands Bond his watch. He says something about make sure you return it, but he says, I think this is your 20th, I believe. Like it's his 20th watch for the 20th film.
Yes, nice. So this is the bit where Q presents Bond with his new car, and it's the infamous invisible car. And Bond throws the instruction manual up and the gun shoots it. So that is a funny bit, but it is ridiculous. And the wife was not ranting, but she was like moaning about this bit already. And we next see M and Frost talking. So we find out here that Frost is an undercover agent for MI6. So she's not a double agent, but she is working for MI6, and she's obviously undercover investigating graves at this point.
Yeah, it's another little wrinkle added to the story. We move on to Iceland next. Bond arrives, and we have another elaborate base that the villain holds. This time made of ice, but it feels like it's been a while since we've had that kind of grandiose base of a villain. It's arguably the first one of the Brosnan era, certainly the first one I recall.
I think you're right, Andy, actually. I'm just thinking back to the Brosnan ones. We had Carver, but his was just a television media empire, so he didn't have his was just like a headquarters, wasn't it? GoldenEye, we had 006, but again, he didn't have a villainous base, did he? He had a train that was moving, but you're right, it wasn't some kind of elaborate base. The World Is Not Enough, again, it was just pipelines, her house mansion. You had the nuclear sub that they stole, but again, there was no elaborate base. So I think you're right, Andy. I think this is the one and only in terms of Brosnan era. So just a couple of quick points again from me. So Bond makes a quip to Frost about being icy, and I think this is a bit of a double play, really. So a double kind of layered quip. So again, I think it relates to her name, but also her behaviour to Bond, because she is being very icy to Bond, but he's obviously played it off as well with her name. And this is where we see Graves is having the laser treatment, and we find out he's actually Colonel Moon.
Yeah, this came as a legit surprise to me. I didn't remember this at all, so to find out that they were one and the same, I thought was quite a nice plot twist. Colonel Moon and Gustav Graves, it's the second Bond villain to be portrayed by two different actors in the same film. The first being Colonel Jacques Bouvard, portrayed by Bob Simmons, and Rose Alba. Colonel Bouvard was the French assassin Spectre agent that was in the pre-credits Thunderball funeral sequence, for those keeping score at home. There's a scene here where Bond, he gets in his invisible car and he's following some guards, so obviously they can't see him. And there's a door in the base. The guard goes to swipe his key card on the keypad, but the door's already opening as he swipes, so clearly a timing issue there.
That is a continuity or a goof, Andy. That's a bonus one that we've picked up in the main body of our podcast episode. And we later see Bond and Frost getting it on. So this is Bond girl number 2 in Die Another Day. And meanwhile, Jinx is staying focused. You know, she's infiltrating the dome. And it's nice to see that the American agency are kind of staying focused and not being womanizing like Bond is usually on his missions. But it doesn't go to plan. Jinx gets zapped when she finds Zhao. And this is the first time, I think, especially in the Brosnan era, I can't remember, Andy, if you recall when it happened, we've got the return of the slow-mo camera work. And like I said, it's been a while since we've seen that. I can't recall any other Brosnan films that has had that, but we see it a few times in this movie now.
Yeah, this seems more a staple of the Connery era, doesn't it? So it's strange to see that in effect here. Moving on, Bond goes to find out more about Graves, dives into the icy cold sea, and we see that Jinx is being tortured. She nearly gets killed by a laser, but Bond manages to save her. And there's a fight scene between Bond and Mr. Kill, and there's laser beams shooting around, and they've got to try and avoid them. This for me is when things kind of really started to go downhill. I think this is taking things to a new level in terms of ridiculousness. And also, kind of adding to that, Jinx manages to get control of one of the lasers and shoots Mr. Kill with a headshot.
Yeah, and this is, I would say it's frustrating, but it's Mr. Kill was prattling about with the laser, and he basically turned the laser on and let it slowly prolong the torch, and it's kind of like slowly moving across, where Jinx is like headshot straight away, no messing about with the laser. So I liked her being really decisive there. This is also when we actually find out that Frost is a double agent. So we've got a double agent in MI6, and you know, it all kind of makes sense now. This is the one that portrayed Bond at the beginning and gave Zhao and Colonel Moon, you know, that Bond wasn't the African diamond dealer. So Bond manages to escape though in this high-speed vehicle, and this is where Vlad tells Graves that Bond has beaten his record. And the note I've made there is, read the room, Vlad. This is not the time to tell Graves, because Graves is trying to maneuver the laser, isn't he, to get Bond. And Vlad is kind of like in the background, and he kind of actually steps forward, doesn't he? He said, "Oh, Graves, he beat your record." And he's like, why? Why are you doing that? He's just so silly. And Vlad isn't in it much, is he? He's in, he does a lot of work for Graves, but he's not in it loads. So I thought this was a silly little point.
So we get another surfing scene from Bond here. I thought this was a bit far-fetched as well.
Yes, I agree. And it looked really dated, but I don't know, the comment I made, it looked really dated, but maybe going back to what we said earlier on, it might have just been quite poor and not necessarily dated. But this is a bit, Andy, where you're saying he breaks is it the top off the ice vehicle, and then he uses that to kind of surf on?
Yeah, exactly.
Where he's hanging over
Whilst he's hanging over on the edge of a cliff, he manages to fashion this car into a surfboard and then go surfing, and then it's bad special effects on top. It's all just a bit like ridiculous, isn't it?
It is, yeah, I agree.
We then get the customary Bond car chase scene. This time it's the invisible car versus the mounted minigun car. So Zhao's got a car with a bunch of gadgets on it as well. Maybe he's been to a Q sale.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. The North Koreans have got their own Q branch. This is a scene that I mentioned earlier on, in terms of the wife comments, that she just didn't like it all, this particular bit. Yeah.
We like a good chase scene. If we go back through our previous episodes, I think we've chosen quite a few chase scenes as our favourite scenes, but this was nowhere near good enough for me. But ultimately, Zhao meets a bloody end. Bond shoots a chandelier from... They're kind of driving into the ice palace, I should mention at this stage, so context makes sense. But he shoots the chandelier and it drops onto Zhao in the pool, and then you just see the pool fill with blood.
We're moving to North Korea, South Korea now. So we see Bond and Jinx use the gliders that Andy mentioned in the gadgets section earlier on to make their way into North Korea, because these gliders can avoid radar. And Graves' laser shoots down the missile that I think the Americans have launched. I don't think it's the British, and it's the Americans have launched this missile to shoot down the satellite. Meanwhile, Bond and Jinx have sneaked onto the plane, as Bond didn't have a sniper shot on Graves.
I'll get into the plane in a second, but I want to talk about Charles Robinson, because he is in a scene here where he's talking about the demilitarized zone, but he refers to it as the DMZ. Charles Robinson, of course, being a part of the MI6, British, he should be saying DMZ. And this is a couple of films now where we've had Americanisms. I think it was last week we talked about Bond use the word vacation, whereas in Britain you would use the word holiday. And now we've got Robinson referring to the letter Z, which doesn't exist in the English alphabet. It only exists in the American alphabet. So that's two in a row now where the American audience are being spoon-fed a little bit, I would say.
That's a good catch, Andy. But, the DMZ, as you called it, I must admit, I use DMZ as well in my everyday life. Not like I'm walking around talking about the DMZ to friends and co-workers, but as part of, the research and just, where you see films about, North Korea, South Korea, etc. DMZ is what I've always referenced it at, Andy, so I'm going to have to hold my hands up there.
Now, I could forgive TMZ, which is a media outlet in America, because that's a name, isn't it? Like the singer, rapper Jay-Z. We wouldn't refer to him as Jay-Z because that's not his name, but DMZ should really be DMZ because that's just an initialization. That's just me being picky and probably offending our American listeners at the same time. Apologies, but it's our alphabet and the letter is Z. But let's get back to the plane. So you just mentioned that Bond and Jinx sneak onto the plane. What you didn't mention is the fact that they had to chase it down the runway on foot whilst the plane is moving because it's getting ready to take off. So Bond and Jinx can run faster than a moving plane, can they?
Andy, that's a good point, because it's something that I didn't pick up on until I read your notes. But when I read your notes, it reminded me of the comment you made in GoldenEye with the tank and the train. Do you remember saying about the tank getting ahead of the train? So when I saw your comments there, I think it's valid. It's a valid comment there, Andy. I don't know what the answer is, but you're right.
I think it's quite a common thing in films and TV shows. It really annoys me when you watch like cop shows and they've got their guns out, they're pointed at a moving car, and the car speeds past them. So they just run out into the road and start chasing the car down the street. It's like, no, you need to drive after a car. It's a car. You're on foot. But they seem to think they can outrun vehicles, and this is one of those scenarios. They think they can outrun a plane, only this time they do. But let's get back to it. So Graves explains to General Moon that he's actually, you're not General Moon to me, you're Dad. Graves is actually Colonel Moon. I think I've got that right way around. Colonel's the son, isn't it? Yeah. And this is where Graves uses the laser satellite to blow up a path in the demilitarized zone, DMZ, by destroying the mines.
So Graves ends up killing his father, and we get another slow-mo effect in these scenes. And also a bullet shoots a hole in one of the windows, and people are being sucked out as well. So things are going down quite quick here, actually. Vlad is sucked out here, so he doesn't get any kind of big death, but he's a peripheral character anyway.
Yeah, I did have a question about this. So obviously Graves ends up killing his father I think mainly because his father's like disappointed in what he's become. But are we really supposed to feel sorry for a North Korean general? Because let's not forget, he is a North Korean general. He is one of the villains of this piece himself. Are we really supposed to have sympathy for him?
Yeah, I know, Andy. I get your point here, because Bond at this point is observing, isn't he? Through the he's come through the door and he's observing this. So you do kind of get the feeling you are supposed to feel a bit sorry for General Moon here, because his son has basically become a Westerner, hasn't he? And he's just disappointed, and he can't take the whole transformation thing, really. So I do get your point there. It's a bit like you said, he's a bad guy. He's a lesser evil, though, in this film, isn't he?
Yes, I would say he is the lesser of two evils, but he's still on the side of evil.
No, I agree. But so this is after this bit, this is the bit where we see Graves and Bond and Frost and Jinx fight scene. And like I said, this is probably it is my favourite scene. But like I said, I did struggle to pick one.
I enjoyed this scene. I think there were some really good parts to it, but there were some bits that were a little bit silly, a little bit daft. But generally, it was a good scene.
No, I agree. And Graves ends up getting the upper hand, and he says, I like this bit because he's just being really, I don't want to say I don't think it's childish, but he's being really petty. And he says something basically, oh, look, here's two parachutes, and then slings one out. So there's only one parachute. But Bond, however, gets another chance. He gets the upper hand, and he uses the device that Graves has, and he shocks him, and then he falls out into one of the jet engines and obviously dies.
Yeah, Bond and Jinx then escape by getting on the helicopter as it's dropped out of the plane and it's breaking up in the sky. And this is where we get the funny shot of the red Ferrari sticking up in the water, like river or pond or whatever it is.
And we're now at MI6 and the hut. I don't think it ever explains where the hut is. And we see Bond and Moneypenny getting it on. And they're about to have sex, but it turns out it's just another VR simulation. And this didn't get me, Andy. This didn't fool me, because as soon as it happened, I thought, oh yeah, it's the VR machine. And also, thinking back to your earlier comment, Andy, about the VR machine. When it happened, as soon as I saw Moneypenny with, I think it's a bullet in the head, I knew something was sus. But obviously then we find out it's VR. But, considering that is pretty much the first thing that Bond sees coming out of his office, I thought, yeah, something's not right there. Because she, apart from these two VR scenes, does she have any actual interaction with Bond? She doesn't, does she?
I don't think she does, no. And you're right about it being suspect. I get the part about M being held hostage as part of the VR, that's somewhat plausible. And maybe if Moneypenny was injured rather than killed, you could, as a viewer, you could start to think, oh, this is going downhill. But as soon as you see bullet in the head, you think, yeah, this is not right.
Yeah, definitely. And the film ends with Bond and Jinx in bed, surrounded by lots of diamonds, like Andy mentioned, in the goofs and continuity era here.
And then we're on to the closing credits, and we get a dance version of the song Die Another Day, which is, again, a very strange choice of song for the ending credits. What I've put is, this is a perfect example of taking a bad song and making it worse.
It just felt really out of place, that end song. Because you mentioned in Tomorrow Never Dies, didn't you, with Surrender, and I think you said you preferred that to the main theme song, whereas this one, like you said, it's taken a song that isn't great and it made it worse. So basically, the Die Another Day film is bookended by two pretty poor songs.
It is, yeah. One thing I've not mentioned for quite a while now, and I've not really been taking note of it, is that I can't remember whether in the closing credits there was the line "James Bond will return," because that is a staple of the closing credits. You know, in the early days, it would not only say James Bond will return, it would give you the title of the next film, and then it just changed to James Bond will return at some point. So I've lost track of them a little bit, and foreshadowing to what's to come next, I don't know whether it said it in the credits or not.
I don't think it does, Andy. And yeah, you used to you picked up these, didn't you, during this season of the podcast? You picked up these ones, but maybe I can't pinpoint when they stopped doing it. But maybe, with the uncertainty of actors playing Bond and things potentially changing, maybe that's why they haven't done. Because have they had it at all in the Bond films? I don't recall having anything in the Bond films.
I think they did have it in The World Is Not Enough. I think it did.
Okay.
It didn't say the film title. I think it did just say James Bond will return. But I don't recall it for this film. But I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong.
Yeah, so listeners, let us know if Andy is wrong or not.
Doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And thus ends the film.
The Rain Room.
Let's get some one-liners or some quotes in. So the first one I'm going to pick out is from the Ice Palace of Graves. It's between Bond and a bartender, and Bond simply says, "Vodka martini, plenty of ice, if you can spare it."
And the next one is between Bond and Verity, who's obviously played by Madonna. Verity says, "I see you handle your weapon well." And James Bond goes, "I've been known to keep my tip up." And another quick one here, a one-liner by Miranda Frost. "I know all about you. Sex for dinner, death for breakfast."
There's a bit of an interaction between Bond and Graves, and this is where Bond realises that Graves is not who he seems. So Bond starts with, "So you live to die another day, Colonel?" Graves responds, "At last. I was beginning to think you would never guess." Bond replies, "Was it painful, the gene therapy?" Graves says, "You couldn't possibly imagine." Bond, "Oh good, I am glad to hear it." Graves, "But there have been compensations, like you floating around in peril, granting you life day by day just to see you get wise. It's been fun." To which Bond finishes, "Well, the fun is about to come to a dead end."
The last one from me is between Bond and Zal. So James Bond says, "I've missed your sparkling personality." And then Zal punching Bond in the stomach. How's that for a punchline?
That might have been my favourite one, actually, of the film. One final one between Bond and Raoul. Bond, "I'm looking for a North Korean. Tourist? Terrorist. Well, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter."
So the next segment is the book versus movie. So we've picked out 3 here. So the first one I'm just going to kick off is Bond is taken to hospital in South Korea and not Hong Kong, as it is detailed in the movie.
Yeah, there's also more information in the book around Colonel Moon's transformation to Graves and how he came to power. And it also gives the backstory of Graves and Frost from their time at Harvard.
Yeah, and the last point for me is, otherwise, apart from these two, and there's some minor differences as well that we haven't captured in the podcast, the novelisation actually stays quite true to the film, which is a rarity. From the last few podcasts that we discussed, me and Andy, we picked out some differences, considering that the novelisation is based on the screenplay, whereas in Die Another Day they've kept it quite true, really, this time round.
Okay, Jay, let's lighten the mood a little bit. You know, one of my world famous jokes, or in this case, it'd been more of a pun, I would say.
Yes, I love a pun, Andy.
So here's one for you. If James Bond movies were about food, this film would have been called Diet Another Day.
That's a very good pun, Andy, and it's something I'd live to, that is. Live by, should I say. Diet Another Day. I never diet. I should diet, Andy, but I don't.
I know the feeling. I'm now trying to think of other puns related to food about the Bond movies, but I must admit I'm struggling. So if I carry on, this is going to fall flat on its arse.
Shall we move on quickly to the quiz?
Yeah,
then?
let's crack on. Yeah, let me use my brain for good.
Are you ready? Let's start the quiz.
Okay, so I've got the quiz all ready. So just to recap for any new listeners out here, this is the segment where I'm going to throw 4 statements at Andy, and 2 are correct and 2 are incorrect. And our regular listeners will know Andy's got a pretty good success rate during the quiz. So I do need to try harder. He's always at least got 50%. He's never got all the statements wrong, so he's doing well. And we are tracking, how many he gets right each week. So we're having an end of season special episode, episode 26, and we're going to recap in terms of how Andy did in terms of the quiz. So, are you ready, Andy, this week?
I'm feeling good. Let's do this.
Oh, he's feeling good. The pressure is on me then. So, first statement. Pierce Brosnan disliked the gadgets and overblown effects on this movie. He suggested to the producers that the franchise go back to its more low-key, darker roots. The next statement. The producers used the famous ice hotel in Sweden to film the scenes set in Iceland. So that's where the ice palace that we have. Statement 3. There are only 2 fully qualified stuntmen of Asian descent in the UK. To get around this, they tapped local martial arts clubs for more talent. And then the last statement. Pierce Brosnan and Timothy Dalton are the only 2 Bonds to have gadget-filled cars from Q in all of their movies. Would you like me to repeat any of those statements? And listeners, feel free to play along as well. See how you get on and compare yourself against Andy.
You've done well this week, Jay. This is
thank you.
Another tough one. The statement 3. Is it statement 3 around the only 2 fully qualified Asian stuntmen in the UK? I just cannot think which way that one's going. That's the one that's really stumped me. So I'm going to dismiss that one so I don't spend too long thinking about it. The ice hotel in Sweden, that would make sense. I don't think they would build an ice set. That seems extravagant. If one already exists, why not use it? So I'm going to say the ice hotel statement, statement 2, I'm going to say that is true. So statement 3 false, statement 2 true. So I'm torn between 1 and 4 now. I'm going to say that the first statement about Brosnan suggesting a return to Bond's roots, I'm going to say that's the true statement, and I'm going to say the Brosnan and Dalton gadget cars is the false statement, because I'm just struggling to think what gadgets Dalton had on his car for those two films. So I'm struggling here a little bit. So I'm going to go true, true, false, false.
Okay, starting from the first one, you are correct. The Brosnan disliked the gadgets and overblown effects, which I find, I don't know if funny is the correct word, because obviously Daniel Craig got that, didn't he, in the reboot. So Brosnan is banging on about, you know, he doesn't like the gadgets, the overblown effects of the movies, and he wants to go to the darker routes, which you probably say is kind of going back to the Sean Connery era, and then obviously that's what the producers do in Daniel Craig era. So you are correct there. The next statement you have said is, did you say that's true or false? Sorry, you said that was true, didn't you?
I did indeed. The Ice Hotel, I think, is true.
Okay, you said that is true. That is incorrect. The producers actually spent 6 months building an ice hotel set for this movie. So 6 months is a long time to build an ice palace. And a little tidbit here, Andy. The reason why I threw that in is because when I went to Sweden when I was at uni, I stayed at a hostel, and I went to an ice bar in Sweden, and you could only stay in there for, I think it was like 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and you had to wear these big coats that you go in there and you have a drink and stuff, but you had to come out. So I never stayed at an ice hotel, but I stayed at an ice bar. So that's where I kind of got the idea from. So I have deceived you there.
That's well played, and probably explains the earlier point around the budget being so high if they're having to spend so much time and effort on an extravagant set. So yeah, I was wrong about that.
So the next one you have said was false, which is the Asian stuntmen. That is actually correct. Apparently there was only 2 fully qualified Asian stuntmen in the UK, and they had to go round local martial arts to find the talent to do the scenes in North Korea with the military. And that brings us on to the last one, and you said that was correct, and that is actually false. So
No, I said that was false. I did.
Did you?
I did. True, true, false, false was my answer.
Oh, okay. Let me change that. Yes, sorry. It is incorrect, and you were right. So actually, Andy, Pierce Brosnan is the only Bond to have a gadget-filled car from Q in all his movies. So Sean Connery had one, which was the Aston Martin DB5 in Goldfinger and Thunderball. Sir Roger Moore had one, which was the Lotus in Spy Who Loved Me and For Your Eyes Only. And Timothy Dalton had one for the Aston Martin in The Living Daylights. So he's the only Bond to have an Aston Martin in all his movies, and to be fully equipped as well with gadgets. So he had a DB5 in the first 3 films as well. So
there we go. Good to know.
So Andy, so not for including in the notes, but basically you can only ever get 0, 50% or 100%, can't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Now you change the rules. So I've got quite a few 50s recently, it seems like.
Yes, so let me we're going to carry on. So I'm just going to update the tracker for our end of season. So that is 50% this week. So yeah, 2 back-to-back 50s now, and then you got 100%, 50-50. So yeah, so well done, Andy.
The rating room.
Our other regular feature now is the rankings review, and this is where we talk through all the different rankings. So I'm going to kick us off and talk about the run times. So Andy mentioned at the top of the pod it was 2 hours 13 minutes, and Andy mentioned it does seem like one of the longer Bond films, and it is actually joint second longest with License to Kill at 2 hours 13 minutes. So that still remains behind on Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is 2 hours 22 minutes. Now, the Pierce Brosnan era has come to an end. So what does that mean in terms of average run times? So Brosnan has been in 4 films, and when you average that out, so that's 8 hours 30 minutes in total, that equates to 2 hours 8 minutes. So in terms of the run times per actor, he's actually the 3rd longest running Bond in terms of average run times, and that's behind Timothy Dalton and George Lazenby. In terms of kill count, I mentioned earlier on, it was a healthy 31. And that's actually the joint second again this week. So it's leveled with The Spy Who Loved Me on 31. And now we've had the full 4 films of Brosnan. How does that kill count by actor look? So Brosnan he is the deadliest Bond. So we said that last week as well. He's got 135 kills across his 4 films, which is an average of 33.8, which is very, very high compared to Roger Moore in second place with 12.9. So he's out there at the moment. Will Daniel Craig beat him? And the last one for me before I pass over to Andy is the Martini watch. And as Andy mentioned, he does have a martini. Sorry, Andy doesn't have a martini. Bond has a martini in Die Another Day. So he's keeping his run of martinis at the moment.
Yeah, I'm sticking to water whilst we record, excuse me. The James Bond introduction for Die Another Day comes after 51 minutes and 56 seconds, as we mentioned earlier. So out of the 20 films we've had so far, 17 feature the introduction, 3 don't. And of the 17 that feature the introduction, this is actually the 3rd longest amount of time it takes for it to appear. Slightly longer than The Spy Who Loved Me, 35 minutes in 14th place, and slightly quicker than what we saw in License to Kill, which was 1 hour and 8 minutes. So 15 out of 17 in terms of shortest, or the 3rd longest, depending on which way you want to look at it. Hat wearing, hat throwing doesn't appear in this time, so that's 2 in a row where we have no hats making an appearance. And for the 4th film in a row, we have no appearance by Felix Leiter. So that's quite the statement there. That if we look back through the list of films, Felix Leiter has appeared in at least 1 Connery film, and in at least 1 Moore film, and in at least 1 Dalton film, but nothing for Brosnan out of 4. He didn't appear in the Lazenby film either, but that's just a one-off. But this is 4 Brosnan films and no appearance by Felix Leiter. So is that character ever going to return? I guess we will find out soon enough. And probably the favourite stat of Jay is box office. So, as mentioned earlier, this had a budget of $142 million, and the actual dollar amount taken worldwide was just over $431 million. In terms of actual takings, it's top of the list by quite a margin, has to be said. But for the purpose of ranking, we're doing the adjusted figures. So what does that mean in today's money? It would be approximately $691 million, which would actually place it in 9th out of 20. So a respectable effort, massively profitable. In real terms, the most takings, but in the adjusted table, it's kind of mid-range. Just to expand on that a little bit further, so we looked at the average for each Bond actor in terms of their adjusted box office takings. And what that means is that Sean Connery is top of the pile. His adjusted box office total is just under $5.5 billion, averages $914.9 million across his 6 movies in terms of the adjusted amount. Obviously, real amount's very different because of the time difference. Brosnan actually comes in 4th out of 5, just below George Lazenby in terms of adjusted amount, with $648 million compared to Lazenby's $653.5, but way above what we saw from Dalton. His average was 426.8. So quite a gap from 4th to 5th between Brosnan and Dalton there.
Yeah, and one thing, Andy, because that's something that we're newly tracking. I'm intrigued to see how Daniel Craig performs. Is it the older films are being favoured because the kind of like the spy action genre is quite unique in terms of Bond, and now with, you know, in the 90s, noughties, even the 80s, you know, you've got a lot of competing films and other blockbusters out there as well. So I'm quite intrigued to see how Daniel Craig fits into the list.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider there for Craig. Not only, you know, how the films have performed, but do the budgets change? Is things like recent pandemics, other economic factors? But it'd be good once the list is complete to really do a bit of a deep dive into that.
Yeah, definitely. We can pick that up in our bonus episode. So moving on, I've got the lovely job of kicking off the Bond girls. So there's only 2 Bond girls in Die Another Day, and I think they're fairly strong. So I think there's been, you know, we've mentioned, well, The World Is Not Enough Bond girls were a bit lower than Andy's. So let's see if we're going to be similar this week or continue to be a bit of a difference. So I'm going to start from bottom, and Miranda Frost for me goes in at 25. So that's between Magda and Pam from Octopussy and License to Kill. And Jinx, so I said last week, I think it was last week or maybe the week before, I tend to favour the older Bond girls. So in my top 10, the only Bond girl from the 90s was Wei Lin, but that little jinx maybe has been broken, with Jinx entering at number 7. So she has gone in there and she is sandwiched between Wei Lin in 6th and Honey Rider in 8th. So I've got some modern Bond girls finally in my top 10, Andy. Whereas I think, I'm quickly looking, I think you've had that entry. You know, you've had some recent ones in there, or at least one recent one in there, in your top 10, haven't you, compared to mine? Mine, I think I said last week, wasn't it? I seem to be favouring the older films in the franchise in my, say, top 10, top 20. Where does Jinx and Miranda Frost feature for you, Andy, this week?
So I'll start with Miranda Frost. She's the slightly weaker of the 2, I thought. So similar to you, I've got her in at 22, so not too dissimilar to where you've placed her. For me, that puts her between Holly Goodhead and Natalia Simonova. Jinx, for me, I thought was slightly stronger. Interesting in terms of placement, you've gone just below Wei Lin. I've gone just above Wei Lin in my rankings, but what that means is number 13, so slightly lower than where you positioned her. Very, very strong Bond girl, I thought. But for me, just some of the more recent entries like a Xenia on a top and an Electra King, for example, were just enough to keep her out of that top 10 area. But 13th and 22nd, considering we now have 68 Bond girls on the list, I'd say that's a respectable effort for the 2 of those.
Definitely, 68 is not bad, is it, Andy, from 20 films?
About an average of 3.4 per film there. There you go, maths in everyday life. Let's move on to the theme song, Die Another Day by Madonna. I don't really need to say much about this. It's a slam dunk, bottom of the pile. 20th out of 20. It's not a bad song per se, but it is a very bad Bond song. It just does not fit the genre at all for me.
I agree, but I've got a difference, Andy. So I have slotted Madonna in at 16. So Die Another Day is sandwiched between the original Dr. No song and Tomorrow Never Dies. you know, we mentioned in the last few weeks that Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough don't really feel like Bond songs, and I agree. And I don't think Die Another Day is a great song, but for me, it's not the worst song. So I have put it in 16th. So that might have surprised you, it might not. I must give credit though, I thought the song fitted the opening credits really well. And it might have been how they've linked it all in, but I thought it did go well with the opening credits, which obviously I said I really enjoyed. Which brings us on to the next one we're monitoring. So I said that, you know, I thought it really fitted the opening credits well. I said at the top of the podcast that I thought it was really strong, and I've actually put Die Another Day in second place. So just to recap, you've got your scorpions, your models, Bond being tortured. The opening credits are used to kind of bridge the time jump. You've got various torture bits in here in terms of hot coals, electrical torture, sparks. You've got your ice models, which obviously links into Iceland as well. And I just really enjoyed it, Andy. I thought the opening credits were really, really good. So it's sandwiched between Goldfinger, which is my favourite still, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which it has all your throwbacks, you know, to the previous Bond films before, you know, George Lazenby. So I really thought it was a strong one. You didn't like the theme song, but what did you think of the opening credits?
So the credits themselves I thought were very, very strong. I'm slightly further down the rankings than you. I've got it in at number 6, which is still a strong effort. Just I slightly preferred The World Is Not Enough and GoldenEye. But I do think the idea of moving the film along and it being brand new scenes that added to the story, I thought was a really novel concept, and it was very well done. I just think some of the other things that went with it just let it down slightly for me. Otherwise it could have been right up there. But still, 6 out of 20 I think is a strong effort, and that's three of my top 6 are Brosnan films. So they're clearly doing something right with the opening credits. Moving on, this one might take a while. We're on villains next. So as mentioned at the start of the pod, there are, let me count them, 8 villains to go through. So this makes it quite tricky in terms of not only differentiating between them in the film itself, but then also between all the other villains that we've seen so far. We're now up to 71 total, so it's quite a convoluted process this was, but I tried to stay true to the principles and not just make any rash decisions. I'm going to go bottom to top, and straight away I'm going to dismiss Dr. Alvarez as number 70 of 71, Vlad 69 of 71, and Mr. Kill 68 of 71. I don't think the film needed any of those characters, and I don't think they particularly added anything. They were just fill-in screen time, so I'm being dismissive, but I can't think of really any positives to keep them up there. Jumping a couple of places, well, 3 places. In 65 I've got General Moon, and again this was a character that was somewhat integral to the plot, particularly in the opening and closing scenes or sequences, but nothing about him was particularly villainous other than the fact that he was a North Korean general. Therefore he is on the bad guy's side, but he didn't necessarily do anything out of the ordinary from what you'd expect a villain to do. So that for me is why he ranks so low on the list. I want to move up again further. So just for clarity, we've actually separated Colonel Moon and Gustav Graves as 2 separate characters because they are portrayed by 2 different actors, and also their mannerisms are not necessarily the same, although they are technically the same person in terms of how they're portrayed in their respective scenes. They're not so much. So we've separated the 2 for the purpose of this. So Colonel Moon comes in at number 52. Again, similar to General Moon in that, he's clearly on the side of evil because he's a North Korean colonel, but doesn't do a great deal to really stand out as a ultra-villainous villain. He is integral to the start of the film, and obviously gets quote-unquote killed at the start, and is part of the plot that gets Bond captured. So that's what propels him up the list slightly, but not one of the stronger villains, I would say. We then take a bit of a big jump. We're now into the top half, and with placing at number 30 of 71, I've got Zhao. Zhao I thought was quite a menacing henchman. The look was really, really good. The mannerisms were good. I think he's a very good secondary henchman. So it comes in at number 30, just above Scarpine and just below General Orlov. Then, moving further up again, number 23, I've got Miranda Frost. Yeah, the reveal that she was actually not on Bond's side after all, I thought was very well done. I think they were going for a similar approach to what they did with Electra King in The World Is Not Enough. But because it has already been done, and it wasn't done quite as well, it let it down slightly for me. But still, 23 of 71 is a respectable entry. She comes just below Dario and just above Carl Stromberg for me, which finally means that Gustav Graves gets the number 1 slot in the film, but number 18 overall. A relatively strong villain. Nothing particularly special. My kind of benchmark here was Max Zorin, and because I thought there was quite similar mannerisms in terms of their ego, their body language, the way they carry themselves, but I preferred Zorin slightly. Zorin's in at number 16. I've got Graves in at number 18. So a bit of a mixed bag. Quite a few weak and unnecessary villains, I would say, which probably let the film down overall. What about you, Joe? What do you think?
I agree, Andy, in terms of what your closing statement there. So we've got a lot of villains here, like Andy said, and like you said, Andy, some of those didn't even need to be in there. So I've gone with Dr. Alvarez, Vlad, and General Moon in 64, 65, and 66 position. Like you said, they didn't even need to really be in the film. I've actually put Colonel Moon down in 60 place as well, because he's only in the beginning, so he's not in it much in terms of screen time, so that's why he's not in it, not higher up on my list. Mr. Kill, I've got him in at 58, so 10 places higher than where you've got him. But again, he is a weak villain. He is a henchman. He's silly with the laser as well. But he's higher than the others because he does seem to take pleasure in torturing people. So that's why. So he's not very high. The villains do let this film down as well, as on top of all the other things that we've mentioned. So Miranda Frost, I've actually put her in 40th. So that is between Necros from The Living Daylights and Blofeld from Russia with Love. And I've got a slight difference in order here. So Andy had Gustav Graves, the highest placed person, villains in this film, whereas I've got him actually in 32nd position, and Zhao as the number 1 villain in 27th position, just because really Zhao, I think, is more intimidating in terms of his appearance. Gustav Graves, I think he actually mentions in the film he's kind of modelled himself on like Bond, how he acts as well. And Zhao, I put between Onatop and Renard from The World Is Not Enough and GoldenEye. I just don't think the villains are that strong in this movie. So they're not even making the top 25. So they're nowhere near my top 10. So I'm a bit disappointed here. But like me and Andy said, the bottom few, Mr. Kill, Colonel Moon, General Moon, Vlad, Dr. Alvarez. For me, you know, they didn't. They could have easily not been in there. Colonel Moon, you could argue, needed to be in there just because of his transformation. But apart from the opening scene, he's not in there anymore because obviously he's had the transformation. So that's my rankings. So moving on to the next one is our movie. So we both said at the top of the pod what we gave Die Another Day. So just to recap, I gave Die Another Day 5 out of 10. And as always, we're not having any films in tied position. So I've got, let's have a look. I've got 6 films with 5 out of 10. And I've actually placed Die Another Day one spot behind The World Is Not Enough and one spot above Moonraker. So like I said, they're all 5 out of 10, but for me it was slightly weaker, only slightly weaker than World Is Not Enough, but better than the Star Wars James Bond film Moonraker. What about you, Andy?
So I too gave this 5 out of 10, and I too placed it in 18th out of 20. So I've got 4 films with a 5 out of 10 rating. So Die Another Day came just above The Man with the Golden Gun, which I also gave 5, and just below The Living Daylights and Diamonds Are Forever. Moonraker still remains rooted to the bottom of my table, but it's interesting how, you know, we had such vastly different opinions of The World Is Not Enough, but we're bang on with our Die Another Day ratings in exactly the same position. Let's talk movies by actor. So for me, what that does, it puts it bottom of the pile for the Brosnan era. Just to recap what I've got so far. So I've got The World Is Not Enough with 8 out of 10, GoldenEye with 7, Tomorrow Never Dies with 6, and Die Another Day with 5. Overall, that means an average of 6.5 for Brosnan, which is quite respectable, I would say. Jay, do you want to just recap your view of the Brosnan era?
Yeah, so I've got GoldenEye 8 out of 10, Tomorrow Never Dies 7 out of 10, and then The World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day 5 out of 10. So for me, it is a quite clear deterioration in films on my one. So that's a total of 25 out of 40, so only one less than Andy, and that means the average is 6.3.
Just moving on as well, what does that mean for the average score by Bond actor? So from my perspective, that puts Brosnan in joint first with Connery, who I also gave an average of 6.5. Roger Moore was 6.1, and Dalton with an average of 6. Of course, we've mentioned this before, but we're excluding Lazenby because of just the one film, but I gave his effort a 7 out of 10. Jay, do you want to just recap your scores?
Yeah, so Die Another Day meant that Pierce Brosnan has got 6.3 out of 10. So in terms of averages, Sean Connery remains on top at 7, Timothy Dalton 6.5, Pierce Brosnan 6.3, and Roger Moore popping up the bottom with 5.9. And as Andy mentioned, George Lazenby has been excluded. Just for information though, I gave Lazenby's one film 8 out of 10. So Andy, I'm going to be honest here. Before we started to do the podcast, I imagined Brosnan films would have scored higher than Timothy Dalton's, if I'm being honest. So it has surprised me actually that he has films in terms of my averages being lower than Timothy Dalton. So that moves us on now to Bond actors. So this is where we basically say where we rate the Bond actors. So this is separate to the films, just because we might have a Bond actor high doesn't necessarily mean their films have been rated high. So pretty much since we started to do the Pierce Brosnan era, I've had him in at number 2 behind Connery and above Roger Moore, and that's not changed in Die Another Day. So to recap, now we've had the full 4 films of Brosnan. I've got Connery number 1, Brosnan 2, followed by Roger Moore, Dalton and Lazenby. So no change for me this week. What about you, Andy?
Yeah, so our top 3 is identical. I've also gone with Connery remains at the top, followed by Brosnan, followed by Moore. I've got Lazenby ahead of Dalton in my rankings. Well, I think what's interesting is if we look back to what we determined were our rankings before we started rewatching the movies, so just based on our gut feel on memories past, I had Roger Moore ahead of Brosnan, and that's turned out not to be the case now. I've changed my thinking. And I also had Dalton ahead of Lazenby, and rewatching has changed my mind on that as well. So it's quite interesting that looking at the films through fresh eyes, more mature eyes, changes our way of thinking about these actors.
It does, because looking back at my list, I had Brosnan as number 1 and Connery as number 2. So I know they're only one place different, but I honestly remembered the Brosnan films being better than they were. So it has surprised me a bit rewatching these films. But like I said last week, I do think Brosnan is a brilliant Bond. I think he's, with Roger Moore, he was not to the extreme, but in terms of he was definitely more the smooth lover type of Bond. And then you got your Connery is kind of like your killer Bond, more rough. Brosnan, I think, kind of fits in the middle and kind of has, I can't think, what's that kind of visual chart that you have, and you have those little spikes that go, you see it in football a lot.
Oh, like the spider diagram.
Yeah.
I mean, or
Yeah, spider diagram. I think that's, like radial kind of their point.
Yeah.
Pierce Brosnan, I would say, is one of those where he would be pretty much average across all the key characteristics, whereas like other people might have spikes. I would say Brosnan is the one that is consistent across them all. He's just let down in his films for me.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I think what we've done is we've tried to differentiate the films from the performance, and I think Brosnan is, well, judging by the rankings, I've enjoyed the Brosnan films more than I expected to, but still some of the films have let him down. He's been very good throughout in his role, but the films have not necessarily always lived up to that hype. I've gone a bit more extreme with my highs and lows, but I think this week particular has demonstrated that it could have been a lot worse had there not been a stronger Bond in place. Like, for example, this film with someone like a Dalton, I think could have been a real flop.
I agree. And I was just going to ask you a question, but I don't think it's the right time, because I was going to say, when in the next film that obviously rebooted the franchise, and Brosnan obviously, mentioned earlier, he said, there's too many gadgets, wanted to go back to a darker type of tone, more realistic. It'd be interesting to see what would have happened if Brosnan was in the Daniel Craig films. I don't think he could have done, because they rebooted it. I don't think he could have done Casino Royale. But what would have happened if another actor had the Brosnan films and Brosnan did, the Daniel Craig films? How different would they be?
It's interesting to think about, but we'll never get the chance, because this is effectively the end of the Bond franchise, and then a new Bond franchise begins next week. I'd normally try and think of something remotely witty to say at this point, but it feels like this is the end of an era, and then we've got another era to come, haven't we? So I think we just stop recording now and sign off, and let's start this podcast series again next week when James Bond franchise starts again next week.
The Rating Room.
This is the 60-second review by a James Bond superfan. This week's reviews are provided by Toby and Stuart. Toby, you have 60 seconds. Start the clock.
Brosnan's final outing as Bond opens with a spectacular and worthy pre-credit sequence with surfing, explosions and a hovercraft chase. The Madonna theme song sequence is cleverly used to tell the story of 007's torture and leads us into the movie. Our villain is Gustav Graves, a mysterious, wealthy and media-savvy billionaire played by Toby Stephens, diamond-encrusted Zhao his henchman. Judi Dench returns as M, but playing it as an angry mother, causing Bond to go rogue to put the world to rights. Bond finds his way to Cuba to do some old-school spy work in search of Zhao, where he comes across bikini-clad American agent Jinx, played by puntastic Halle Berry. Having cold-heartedly murdered a doctor, she and Bond realise they are on the same mission. It moves at a good pace, arriving in London where our villain is introduced, and the film starts its downward turn into invisible cars, sword fight, ice palace, lasers, yes, Dr. Evil would be impressed, and an implausible kite surfing scene, surrounded by an excessive number of puns and one-liners.
Stuart, you have 60 seconds. Start the clock.
Sigmund Freud, review this. Yes, it's the CGI surfing, face swapping, mojito drinking, ice hotel racing extravaganza that is Die Another Day. Now there's a mouthful. Bond is betrayed and tortured in North Korea while Madonna is singing constantly in the background. I doubt he cherished that thought. Bond is then traded, BG beard and all, and goes on an adventure so absurd it makes Face Off look like a documentary. So, if you've always wanted to be an ornithologist, you wonder what Madonna would look like as a fencing instructor who doesn't really fence. You can read people like a book, you love vanishing cars, and Death for Breakfast, who doesn't? Then this is for you. The film starts off like a classic, but the quality lasts less like a slow-burning Delicado and more like the pack of Hamlet I bought last Friday. 2 mojitos out of 5.
A big thank you to Toby and Stuart for recording this week's 60-second review by James Bond superfan on The Rating Room. Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.
The Rating Room.